He did not believe in his mother's sudden death and insisted on an exhumation. When the coffin was opened, everyone was shocked. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what you think about this case. Rain drizzled over the cemetery, forming tiny rivulets that traced patterns on the polished stone headstones. A gray sky loomed overhead, heavy and oppressive, casting a muted gloom over the gathered mourners. Samuel Johnson stood stiffly at the edge of the open grave, his hands clenched into fists, his breath shallow. His mother, Rosa Johnson, lay inside the coffin, lowered into the damp earth. The priest's voice droned in the background, speaking of eternal rest and the peace of the afterlife, but Samuel wasn't listening. Something felt wrong. The funeral was rushed, too rushed. The people standing around the grave weren't grieving the way they should have been. There were a few hushed sniffles, but mostly silence. People avoided his gaze, looking down at their shoes or off into the distance. His father, Henry Johnson, stood across from him, his expression unreadable. His shoulders were squared, his hands folded in front of him, but his eyes— there was something in his eyes that Samuel couldn't ignore. Not grief, not sorrow, just emptiness. The priest said the final words. The coffin disappeared into the earth. The first handfuls of dirt were tossed in, hitting the wooden lid with a dull thud. Samuel's younger sister, Layla, let out a quiet sob beside him. He put a protective arm around her, but his own mind was elsewhere. The moment the funeral ended, people dispersed quickly. Too quickly, as if relieved to be done with it. Samuel watched as neighbors, family friends, and even some of Rosa's colleagues turned away without offering their condolences. They whispered among themselves, their faces set in tight expressions, unwilling to meet his eyes. Henry barely spoke to anyone before turning and walking toward his car, leaving Samuel and Layla standing by the grave. The grave diggers waited in the distance, shovels in hand, ready to cover the coffin. The whole thing had taken less than half an hour. Samuel's thoughts churned. His mother had been healthy. She had no history of heart disease, no symptoms, no warnings. Yet the death certificate had listed a heart attack. He had asked the doctor for more details, but the response had been vague, dismissive. She had simply died in her sleep. No autopsy, no further investigation, just gone. As the last mourners drifted away, Samuel caught sight of an older man standing near the entrance to the cemetery, Mr. Turner, a longtime friend of his mother. Their eyes met for the briefest second before the old man gave him a barely perceptible nod and turned away. Something about it made Samuel uneasy. It wasn't the kind of nod someone gives at a funeral. It was something else, a warning. That night, back at the family home, the air was thick with unspoken words. Layla had gone to bed early, exhausted from the emotions of the day. Samuel sat in the dimly lit living room, staring at the framed photograph of his mother on the mantel. Rosa Johnson had been a force of nature, kind, determined, unshakable in her beliefs. She had fought for the community, spoken against injustice, and never backed down from a fight. He remembered their last conversation. She had seemed restless, unsettled. "People in power don't like being challenged, Sam," she had said, lowering her voice. "Sometimes they'll do anything to silence those who speak too loudly." He hadn't thought much of it at the time. Henry entered the room, his presence cold and heavy. He poured himself a drink at the bar in the corner and took a slow sip. "Go to bed, son," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Samuel didn't move. "Something doesn't feel right." His father's jaw tightened. "Don't start with that. Your mother is gone. You need to accept that." "But how, Dad? She wasn't sick. There was no warning." Henry's eyes darkened. "Life isn't fair, Sam. Sometimes people just go." Samuel stared at him, searching for something, anything that resembled grief. But Henry's face was like stone. Samuel clenched his fists and turned away. He had to find answers. The next day, he visited the doctor who had signed the death certificate, Dr. Whitaker, an older man with a tired face and sharp, calculating eyes. When Samuel asked about the details of his mother's death, the doctor's answers were short and dismissive. "She suffered a sudden cardiac event," Whitaker said. "It happens. I've seen it before. But you didn't perform an autopsy. It wasn't necessary." Samuel narrowed his eyes. "That's not up to you to decide, is it?" Whitaker sighed, rubbing his temple. "Look, son, your mother's gone. Don't go digging up things you don't want to find." The words struck Samuel like a blow. He left the office with more questions than answers. Every door he knocked on seemed to close before he could even ask the right questions. His mother had been well-liked, respected, so why did people seem afraid to talk about her now? That evening, he visited Mr. Turner, the old family friend he had seen at the funeral. The man's small house smelled of old books and cigarette smoke. Turner eyed him warily before letting him in. "You shouldn't be here, Sam," the old man muttered. "You nodded at me at the funeral. What did you mean by that?" Turner sighed heavily and sat down. "Your mother wasn't supposed to die." Samuel's breath caught. "What do you mean?" The old man hesitated. "She had enemies, son, powerful ones. She was making waves, stirring things up. You think people like that just disappear peacefully in their sleep?" Samuel's mind raced. "Do you know what happened to her?" Turner exhaled sharply. "No, but I know this. When people like your mother start making trouble for the wrong folks, bad things happen. And they happen fast." The weight of his words settled heavily on Samuel's chest. His mother hadn't simply died. She had been silenced. That night, unable to sleep, he sat on his bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind spinning with possibilities. If she hadn't died naturally, then what had happened to her? And if she had been killed, why had they rushed to bury her so quickly? Then a terrifying thought struck him. What if she hadn't been dead when they buried her? The idea was absurd, impossible, but it wouldn't leave his mind. The grave had been too fresh, the dirt too loose. His mother had always told him to trust his instincts, and right now his instincts were screaming at him. He made his decision. That night, under the cover of darkness, he grabbed a shovel and headed for the cemetery. The night air was thick and heavy, pressing down on Samuel's shoulders as he made his way through the cemetery. Clouds covered the moon, leaving only the dim glow of streetlights in the distance to cast faint, wavering shadows between the headstones. He carried the shovel tightly in his hands, his grip slick with sweat despite the cool air. His pulse pounded in his ears, a rhythmic, insistent beat that matched the dread growing in his chest. He hesitated for only a moment before stepping onto the fresh grave. The soil had barely begun to settle. He could still see the ridges where the dirt had been smoothed over, the unevenness of a rushed burial. His breath came short and ragged as he drove the shovel into the earth, the first scoop of damp soil falling to the side with a muted thud. With every stroke, his arms burned, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The deeper he dug, the stronger his conviction became. The nagging thought that had kept him awake, the suspicion clawing at his mind, was now an undeniable certainty. Something was wrong. His mother didn't just die. They had buried her quickly, without question, without hesitation, and the city had moved on as if nothing had happened. But he couldn't. The hours passed in silence except for the steady rhythm of his digging. Sweat dripped down his forehead, mixing with the dirt that clung to his skin. His muscles ached, his fingers raw from gripping the handle, but he didn't allow himself to think, didn't allow himself to hesitate. He had to know. The first dull thud against wood sent a shock through his body. He stopped, his breath hitching in his throat. The coffin. He had reached it. His hands trembled as he cleared the remaining dirt from the edges, his mind racing through every possible scenario. If he was wrong, if she had truly passed in her sleep, then what he was doing was madness. But if he was right, if the truth was as horrific as he feared, then he had no choice but to see this through. His fingers found the edges of the coffin lid, slick with dampness from the surrounding soil. He wedged the tip of the shovel beneath the seam and pried it open. The hinges groaned, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet of the cemetery. The scent of decay and damp wood filled his nostrils, making his stomach churn. Then he saw her. His mother lay inside, her face pale in the dim light. But something was wrong. Deeply, terribly wrong. Her hands were clenched into tight fists, fingers curled inward, her nails broken and caked with dried blood. Her arms were stiff, locked in a final, desperate struggle. And the most horrifying sight of all, scratches lined the inside of the coffin lid, jagged marks where her fingernails had scraped against the wood. She had tried to escape. She had been alive. Samuel stumbled backward, his knees giving out as he collapsed onto the damp grass beside the grave. His chest heaved, his mind unable to fully process what he was seeing. He had feared the worst, but the reality was so much more than he could have ever imagined. His mother had been buried alive. A strangled sound escaped his throat, half sob, half gasp. He pressed a shaking hand against his mouth, his whole body trembling as the weight of the discovery settled upon him. The scratches, the bloodied nails, the contorted expression frozen on her face, it all spoke to the unimaginable horror she had endured in her final moments. She had woken up in the darkness, in the suffocating space of the coffin, clawing at the lid, screaming for help that never came. Tears blurred his vision as he crawled back to her, reaching out with trembling fingers to touch her cold, rigid hand. He choked on a sob, barely able to form the words. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he whispered. "I'm so sorry, I didn't know. I'm so sorry, I couldn't save you." But even as grief tore through him, something else ignited within his chest, a slow-burning rage, hot and consuming. This wasn't a tragic accident. Someone had done this to her. Someone had made sure she was buried before her time, and Samuel was going to find out who. His hands shook as he pulled out his phone. His fingers barely obeyed him as he dialed, the numbers blurring before him. The ringing felt like it lasted an eternity before a calm, detached voice answered. 911, what is your emergency? He forced himself to speak, his voice unsteady but firm. "I need to report a crime," he said. "My mother was buried alive. I'm at the cemetery now. You need to come." The dispatcher asked for details, but he barely heard them. The moment he hung up, he sat there, staring at the open coffin, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Who had done this? The most immediate answer sent a wave of nausea through him. His father. Henry had been distant, detached. He had pushed for a quick funeral, had shown no emotion at the service. Had he known? Had he been involved? And then there was Dr. Whitaker, the man who had signed the death certificate without an autopsy. Had he been coerced, paid off, or had he willingly played a part in this? Samuel's stomach twisted as the thought deepened. What if this wasn't just about his mother? What if there was more to it than a single crime? What if this was bigger, something systemic, something planned? Sirens pierced the night, flashing red and blue lights slicing through the darkness. Police cars skidded to a stop near the cemetery gates, officers pouring out and moving quickly toward him. The look of disbelief on their faces as they took in the scene mirrored what he had felt only moments before. Detective Harris, a tall woman with sharp eyes and an unreadable expression, approached him. She took in the side of the open coffin, the lifeless body inside, and then looked at Samuel. "Are you the one who called?" Samuel nodded, barely able to find his voice. "My mother," he rasped. "She was buried alive." The detective studied him for a long moment before motioning for the forensic team to begin their work. Officers surrounded the grave, murmuring among themselves as they documented the scene. The medical examiner arrived shortly after, confirming what Samuel already knew. His mother had been conscious when they buried her. Detective Harris turned back to him, her expression grim. "This is now a homicide investigation," she said. "We need to speak to your father, and we need to know exactly who was involved in this." Samuel felt a surge of cold determination flood through him. His father would be furious when he found out what he had done, but he didn't care. Not anymore. Not after what he had discovered. He wasn't going to stop until he knew the truth. Until he knew who had stolen his mother's life. The police station was cold and sterile, the fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead. Samuel sat at the interrogation table, his hands clasped together so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. His mother's face was burned into his memory, the contorted expression of terror, the broken nails, the scratches lining the coffin lid. The weight of it pressed down on his chest like a lead block. No matter how many times he closed his eyes, he couldn't escape it. Detective Harris sat across from him, flipping through a notepad filled with notes and observations. Her face was unreadable, but her sharp eyes studied him intently. He had told them everything. How he had suspected something was wrong. How the funeral had been rushed. How his mother had been declared dead without an autopsy. And finally, how he had dug up her grave and found the horrifying truth. She tapped her pen against the table and leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about your father." Samuel exhaled slowly, trying to steady his racing thoughts. "He's always been distant. After my mother died, he barely reacted. He pushed for a quick funeral, didn't grieve, and when I started asking questions, he shut me down." Harris jotted something down. "Did he have any conflicts with your mother before she passed?" A bitter laugh escaped him. "Conflicts? My mother was an activist. She fought for people in this city, especially the ones in our community. She stood against people who wanted us gone. My father, he didn't agree with her. He thought she was making trouble, stirring things up too much. He used to tell her to stop pushing." The detective's expression hardened. "And did she ever receive threats?" Samuel hesitated. His mother had never spoken openly about threats, but he knew. He had seen the way she looked over her shoulder sometimes, the way she double-checked the locks at night. The way she had told him, not long before she died, that she had a bad feeling. "She never told me outright," he admitted, "but I know people wanted her silenced." Harris leaned back in her chair, letting out a slow breath. "We brought your father in for questioning." The words sent a jolt of electricity through him. His hands clenched tighter, his stomach twisting in knots. He hadn't seen his father since before the funeral. He hadn't been ready, but now there was no choice. A few minutes later, he was led to a one-way mirror where he could see into the interrogation room. His father sat there, looking perfectly composed, his hands folded neatly on the table. No signs of distress, no grief, just quiet, calculating calm. Harris stepped inside the room and sat across from him. "Henry Johnson," she said, flipping open her notepad, "we're investigating your wife's death. Your son believes she was buried alive." For a fraction of a second, something flickered in his father's eyes. A twitch, a momentary lapse. Then it was gone, replaced by an indifferent stare. "That's ridiculous," he said coolly. "She died of a heart attack. The doctors confirmed it." Harris didn't react. "Then why did your son find evidence that suggests otherwise? Scratches on the coffin lid, bloodied nails, signs of a struggle. How do you explain that?" Henry's jaw tightened. "I don't know what he's talking about. My son has been unstable since his mother died. He's looking for someone to blame." Samuel felt his blood turn to ice. Unstable. His father was trying to discredit him. Harris remained unfazed. She reached into a folder and pulled out a piece of paper, sliding it across the table. "This is your wife's life insurance policy. You are listed as the sole beneficiary." Henry barely glanced at it. "Is that supposed to mean something?" She studied him closely. "It means you had a financial incentive to see her dead." A smirk curled at the corner of his lips. "If I wanted her dead, I wouldn't have buried her alive." Samuel's breath caught in his throat. It was an admission, careless but undeniable. Harris's expression remained unreadable, but Samuel knew she had caught it too. "Interesting choice of words," she said smoothly, "because that's exactly what happened. We found evidence that your wife was given a high dose of a sedative before she was declared dead. A sedative that could have induced a coma. And guess who signed the death certificate without conducting an autopsy?" Henry's smirk faltered. "Whitaker." "Dr. Whitaker," Harris confirmed. "We spoke to him already. He admitted that he was paid to falsify the report. The only question now is, who paid him?" Silence. His father's fingers twitched slightly, the only betrayal of his composed demeanor. Harris leaned forward, her voice like steel. "Was it you?" For a long moment, Henry said nothing. Then, finally, he exhaled and leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he murmured. "Fine. I'll tell you the truth, but you're not going to like it." Samuel's heart pounded against his ribs. His father's eyes flickered with something dark. "I didn't kill her," he said. "She did that herself. She had a weak heart, just like her mother before her. All I did was speed things along." The confession sent a shockwave through Samuel's body. "She was in the way," Henry continued, his voice disturbingly casual. "Always fighting, always pushing. She didn't know when to stop. And people like her, they don't get to grow old in this world. So yes, I gave her something to help her sleep. A little too much, maybe. The doctors did the rest for me." Samuel felt like he was drowning. His father had drugged his mother, put her into a coma, let the doctors declare her dead, and then had her buried alive. "She trusted you," he whispered, though the words wouldn't reach through the glass. Harris's expression didn't change. "And Evelyn?" The smirk returned. "Evelyn was the one who gave me the idea," Henry admitted easily. "She's a nurse, after all. She knew exactly what to use, how much to give. We were going to start a new life together once Rosa was out of the picture." Samuel's breath came in short gasps. Evelyn. The woman he had always thought was just a family friend. His father's mistress. She had helped kill his mother. The weight of betrayal crushed down on him, heavier than anything he had ever known. His father had not only murdered his mother, he had done it without remorse, without hesitation, for money, for convenience, for another woman. Harris leaned back, closing the folder. Henry Johnson, you're under arrest for the murder of Rosa Johnson. You have the right to remain silent. As officers moved in to cuff him, Henry finally looked up, meeting Samuel's eyes through the glass. For the first time, there was something behind them. Not guilt, not regret, just a flicker of amusement, as if he found the whole thing amusing. "You're no son of mine," he spat as they dragged him away. Samuel barely heard him. His entire body felt numb. The world around him was spinning, but there was only one thought in his mind. His mother had been murdered, and now he had one last thing to do. Evelyn was next. Samuel stood outside Evelyn Carter's apartment, his fists clenched at his sides. The building was quiet, the streetlights casting long shadows along the pavement. He could hear his own breathing, ragged and uneven, could feel the weight of the past days pressing down on him like a vice. His mother's face haunted him, frozen in terror, her nails cracked and broken from trying to escape the coffin. His father's smirk, that cold, indifferent confession, echoed in his mind. But it was Evelyn's name that burned like acid in his throat. She had helped him do it. She had given him the drugs. She had sat in their home, smiled at Samuel and Layla, acted like she cared about his mother, all while knowing exactly what was going to happen. The police were already inside. Detective Harris had wasted no time. Within hours of Henry's confession, officers had arrived at Evelyn's door with a warrant for her arrest. Samuel had followed, unable to stay behind, unable to just wait for justice to be served without seeing it for himself. He had to watch. He had to know that she would never walk free again. The door opened, and 2 officers stepped out, dragging Evelyn between them. Her wrists were cuffed, her perfect facade cracking as she struggled, her blonde hair disheveled, her expression twisting from shock to fury. She saw Samuel standing there and sneered, her eyes flashing with something vile. "You have no idea what you've done," she spat, her voice sharp as a blade. Samuel stepped forward, his blood boiling. "I know exactly what I've done," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "I made sure you won't hurt anyone else." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into something almost amused. "Your mother was weak," she said, her voice laced with venom. "She didn't deserve him. Mark and I were meant to be together. She was in the way." Samuel lunged before he could stop himself, but Harris caught him by the arm, pulling him back. "She's not worth it," the detective said firmly. Evelyn only smirked. "Enjoy your victory while it lasts," she whispered before the officers shoved her into the back of the squad car. The door slammed shut, and Samuel watched as the flashing lights carried her away, disappearing into the night. The trial was swift and brutal. Henry and Evelyn's confessions, combined with the forensic evidence from Rosa's exhumation, left no room for doubt. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning with their verdict: guilty on all counts. Henry Johnson and Evelyn Carter were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Samuel sat in the courtroom, his emotions a tangled mess as the judge's gavel struck wood. He had fought for this. He had uncovered the truth, forced the world to see what had been done. But as he watched the guards escort his father and Evelyn out of the courtroom, he felt no satisfaction, no relief, just an aching, hollow emptiness. His mother was still gone. and nothing could change that. In the days that followed, the city erupted. Rosa's murder became national news, her story sparking outrage, protests, demands for justice beyond just the people who had killed her. Investigations were launched into the city's corruption, into the institutions that had let this happen. The doctor who had signed her death certificate was arrested for falsifying medical records, and others like him were placed under scrutiny. Samuel watched it all unfold, feeling the weight of his mother's legacy growing stronger. She had fought to protect her people, to expose the darkness hiding beneath the surface of the city. And even in death, she had forced the truth into the light. 1 week after the sentencing, he returned to the cemetery. The sky was clear for the first time in what felt like forever, the sun casting a golden glow over the grass. He stood before his mother's grave, the new headstone standing tall and unshaken. Fresh flowers adorned the base, left by people she had helped, people who still remembered her fight. Samuel knelt, pressing his palm against the cold stone. "It's over, Mom," he whispered. "They're gone. They can't hurt anyone else." The wind stirred gently, rustling the leaves in the trees. For a moment, the faint scent of jasmine, his mother's favorite, drifted through the air, and he closed his eyes, letting himself believe that she was there. He missed her, every second of every day. But he knew now that she wasn't truly gone. She had fought for justice, and now he would too. Standing up, he took one last look at her grave before turning to leave. The road ahead was long, but he wasn't afraid. His mother's fight wasn't over, and neither was his. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out more videos on the channel and share this one with others who might like it. Thanks for watching.